In our panel session on this Friday, we address the possible diplomatic and security blueprint of the incoming administration as it seeks to address the changing global order. For more, I have Professor Min Jung-hoon from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Professor Min, welcome back.
My pleasure.
I also have Dr. Ko Myung-hyun from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. It's been a while, Dr. Ko.
It's good to be back.
Right. Meanwhile, joining this session virtually is Dr. Patrick Cronin at the Hudson Institute over in Washington, D.C. Dr. Cronin, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Professor Min, we'll start here then. Let's begin with your outlook on the future framework of Korea's diplomatic and security policies under the new Yoon administration, that would be.
Well, basically, I think that the next South Korean government is likely to strengthen the ROK-US alliance. And it will also show a clearer position than its predecessor between US and China. First, regarding the diplomatic position of the next South Korean government, the President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's campaign pledges show that his priority policy goal is to solidify the South Korea's status as a global pivotal country to contribute to freedom, peace, and prosperity based on dignified diplomacy and strong national security. And concerning its relationship with the United States, the President-elect promised to reconstruct the ROK-US alliance and strengthen the comprehensive strategic relationship with Washington by sharing the core values of democracy, market economy, and human rights. So the next South Korean government is expected to work closely together with the U.S. to stably maintain the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. And to do that, it will try to rebuild the combined defense posture with the U.S. and strengthen the ROK-US extended deterrence against the North Korea's nuclear threats. And the next South Korean government is likely to also like to strengthen its cooperation with the U.S. in relation to the U.S.-China strategic competition. So the President-elect campaign's pledges show that his government will participate in the vaccine, climate change, and emerging technology working groups under the Quad. And it will also gradually pursue joining the Quad as a formal member. So overall, it is expected that the next South Korean government will get closer to the United States than China in each overall positions between the two countries.
Right. And Dr. Go, as touched upon by Professor Min, with regard to North Korea's ambitions for nuclear and military might, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol has voiced a hardline stance. Do you care to elaborate on Yoon's stance as shared with the media thus far?
Well, I think when the media characterizes President-elect Yoon's position as hardline, I think the focus is a little bit mistaken in the sense that the hardline doesn't mean that the President-elect Yoon is going to assume a very aggressive attitude towards North Korea. It's more about buttressing the deterrence against North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. So in essence, it's all about building capability to counter the threats coming from North Korea. We know that North Korea has advanced its missile and nuclear programs actually enormously in the last 2 or 3 years. And in a way, President-elect Yoon essentially is proposing to keep up with the level of threats. And I think, as Professor Min just mentioned, this buttressing of deterrence is going to be taking place within the framework of alliance with the United States. Clearly, the Biden administration is very eager to work with President-elect Yoon in order to essentially assume more stronger deterrence posture against North Korea, especially in the light of recent developments, such as the announcement this morning that North Korea had tested ICBMs, essentially in the guise of satellite launch testing. So I think this is what it's going to be about, strengthening the deterrence, but not so much being aggressive towards North Korea, and the diplomacy will always be on the table.
Right. And Dr. Cronin, President Joe Biden and President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol spoke on the phone on Thursday, just hours after the latter's win. What appears to be the response to Yoon's election victory within the diplomatic circle there in the U.S.?
Well, as you can see from the president's conversation, a very positive reaction from the White House. But I think this was also heard from testimony from senior officials on Capitol Hill today and yesterday. Dr. Eli Ratner, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, yesterday, Admiral Aquilino, the U.S. Indo-Pacific Commander today, and General LaCamera, the top U.S. Defense official in Korea, all testifying and talking about the importance of the alliance with Korea and looking forward to working with a new democratically elected government of Yoon Suk-yeol. You know, he's not well known in general in the United States yet, but to the extent he is, it's because he's adopted a very positive approach to U.S. Foreign policy, at least in terms of superficially. We'll have to see whether that is implemented, but it's a very positive reaction at this point.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Min, let's revisit the topic of Pyongyang's nuclear plans. What do you envision with regard to joint efforts by Seoul and Washington to address this challenge?
Well, basically, I think that we can find the pretty good compatibility in the two countries' North Korean policies. Let me a little bit talk about the potential North Korean policies of the next South Korean government. The campaign pledges of the president-elect show that his government will pursue complete and verifiable denuclearization of North Korea, and South Korea will play central roles in international cooperation and various negotiations for the denuclearization. And to that end, the next South Korean government will have a predictable roadmap for the North Korea's denuclearization and maintain international sanctions on North Korea until the complete denuclearization process is achieved. And however, it will open the possibilities for the economic aid if North Korea takes substantial denuclearization measures before the denuclearization process is complete. In addition, it will also try to strengthen the trilateral cooperation among South Korea, US, and Japan to deal with the North Korean problems. So we can find that South Korea and US, the two countries' North Korean policies will be very close in how they will achieve their policy goal of the complete denuclearization of North Korea. So it is expected that South Korea and US will work closely together to deal with the North Korean problems. Specifically, they will work together to strengthen the combined defense posture to deter North Korea's provocations, and they will also maintain economic sanctions on North Korea until the denuclearization process is complete. Meanwhile, they will continue to ask for North Korea to come back to the negotiating table.
Right, and staying on the peninsula, Dr. Ko, North Korea on this Friday reported on Yoon's election victory. Would you say this is an early report? I remember, do correct me if I'm wrong, back in the year 2007, I think Lee Myung-bak's victory was reported a week later.
Exactly. I think in the grand scheme of things, the report actually about President-elect Yoon's victory came out pretty early. I mean, it took a day or so. But then on the other hand, the news itself was actually very short. It was just 2 lines of a news headline, no headline even, actually, very small article, actually stuck in a corner of the Nodong Shinmun newspaper, just describing very plainly that a conservative president, Yoon Suk-yeol, had been elected in South Korea. So in that sense, I think North Korea is very taking very neutral stance, seemingly, but at the same time, a little bit dismissive in the sense that it's actually not treating this as a major news item. But on the other hand, I think North Korea has been criticizing South Korea, not just President-elect Yoon, but President Moon and then the South Korean government for increasing actually the deterrence measures against North Korea, as for example, developing new weapon systems and planning new joint military exercises with the United States. So I think the tone of the North Korean regime regarding the political situation in South Korea is already set. I think it's going to be in sync with what's going on in terms of provocations by North Korea. North Korea has been carrying out increasingly more threatening weapon system testings. And I mean, this is a part of the roadmap that Kim Jong-un had announced earlier this year, which includes potentially a nuclear test. So in that sense, I think there's no need for us to try to figure out whether North Korea is positively predisposed or negatively predisposed to President-elect Yoon, because North Korea's roadmap for provocation is already set over this year.
Right, so you do expect more acts of defiance, so to speak, in the near future?
Yes.
Right. Dr. Cronin, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol has spoken about the importance of advancing trilateral ties among Seoul, Tokyo and Washington to address regional and, of course, broader international matters. Do you foresee constructive collaboration in the near future among these three nations?
Well, I hope so. That's music to the ears of Washington, because the United States is allied with Japan and South Korea, and without both of them cooperating together, we're severely weakened in terms of both deterring North Korea and managing a regional order generally, including vis-a-vis China. So the fact that Yoon Suk-yeol is willing to state up front that he's willing to spend some political capital on shuttle diplomacy, on trying to bring about a better, more cooperative relationship trilaterally, is exactly what we need. We need it because North Korea is acting up. Because the global order is at risk right now. We see that with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but the concern in the region about China's assertiveness in the future. So it's very important for these three countries to be on the same sheet of music. And I think we may see this in May, just shortly after the inauguration, if President Biden is in the region. Maybe the three leaders will get together and reset this trilateral relationship.
Right. Do you envision a summit between President Biden and President-elect Yoon in May then?
I certainly hope so in the latter half of May. You know, we have a war going on. There's a lot happening, but yes, I think this may happen.
Right. Now, Professor Min, both Yoon and Kishida have acknowledged the importance of improving Seoul-Tokyo relations, but what are some of the variables you suppose that may hamper related efforts?
Well, basically, the president-elect mentioned during the press conference yesterday that he want to build a future-oriented relationship with Japan. He said it is important to find out what will be beneficial to both countries and their people in the future rather than in the past. And Japanese Prime Minister congratulated Yoon Suk-yeol's election victory and also expressed expectations or hope for improving the relationship between the two countries. But it's not still unclear whether the two countries or the two leaders will be able to make a compromise over the long-standing historical and territory issues, such as the wartime forced labor and the comfort of women issues, Japan's claims on Dokdo Island, and Japan's recent push for the UNESCO the heritage designation of Southern Mine. Lots of issues going on there. And as you know, Japan has argued that all colonial era issues have been settled under the 1965 pact that normalized the bilateral relations. And Japan also argues that South Korea needed to first put forward a solution to the historical issues. But it's almost impossible for South Korea to accept such an unreasonable argument. In addition, it is expected that the Japanese government will maintain its hardline stance against South Korea in the coming months to mobilize conservative voters in the upcoming upper house election later this year. So personally, I hope that the two countries will find a creative solution that both of them and their people could accept. But I think that still we got a long way to go.
Right, there are many hurdles on that road. And staying here in the region, Dr. Ko, what are your thoughts with regard to Seoul's ties with neighboring Beijing under the Yoon administration?
So I think it's going to be a very difficult situation for President-elect Yoon. Yeah, it's a very zero-sum game-like a situation for Korea. It's a great power competition between the United States and China, and they have a competing demands on Korea in terms of foreign policy and economic ties. So what China is essentially saying is that if South Korea wants to continue good trading relationship with China, then it means that South Korea would have to make compromises when it comes to its security environment and alliance relationship with the United States. On the other hand, the United States is very clear that South Korea has to take a side, and then South Korea being a very democratic free market society, the choice has to be obvious. It lies with the United States. So I think when President-elect Yoon assumes office this May, and we'll be definitely hosting President Biden, hopefully, in May. But then I think he'll also hear from the Chinese counterparts that the South Korea has to be very clear about where its position when it comes to the great power competition between the major powers. I think it's going to be a very different situation from, say, President Moon, in the sense that President Moon, even though he agreed to expand the South Korea's cooperation with the United States when it comes to the Indo-Pacific strategy, didn't really take concrete actions in that regard. But then I think time's up pretty much, and I think President Yoon, but then on the other hand, President Yoon made it very clear what kind of direction he's going to take. And I think that provides clarity. And that's the reason why the Biden administration is actually very content with President-elect Yoon. In that sense, I think the major risk will be for South Korea to manage a potential downside with China after the new government takes office.
Right. And Dr. Cronin, what do you believe needs to be the priority for the incoming administration here in South Korea on the diplomatic front, keeping in mind the current climate of global affairs?
Well, the enemy gets a vote, as we say, and North Korea will be acting up. I expect the satellite launch in April will effectively say that North Korea has a Hwasong-17 ICBM in effect. And that's what President-elect Yoon is going to inherit, I believe, after his inauguration. So his defense stance, which is very strong, including the resumption of alliance military exercises, working on missile defenses, building up defense modernization, all of those are going to be in the context of tense relations with North Korea. So that's going to be very important to coordinate with the United States, with Japan, and to get that right. The global economy is critical as well. Obviously, post-COVID, if we are post-COVID, in terms of the economy, but now with the war, Russia war against Ukraine, the energy, on top of inflation, these issues about the global economy, including weaning ourselves off of autocrats' oil and making sure supply chain is secure, coming up with the technologies of the future. These are going to be critical to coordinate, not just domestically for Korea, but internationally and with allies like the United States.
Right. You mentioned the war, Dr. Cronin. Speaking within your capacity as a scholar, do you believe Korea could do more, perhaps, to side with the U.S. and the West against Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Absolutely. They've spoken out, which has been, we've seen that, we recognize it, but they can do more. They need to do more because global order is at stake. Aggression cannot be allowed to pay. Even though it's in Europe, it will affect Asian security as well.
Right, and keeping in mind what Dr. Cronin has said, Professor Min, what are your words of advice to ensure a smooth transition into a fresh framework of diplomatic and security policies under the incoming Yoon administration?
Well, personally, I think that it could be inevitable for a new government to have different policy orientations from the predecessor. It's mainly because each leader and government has different philosophy, norms, and principles to run the country. And the countries recognize such policy changes when their neighbor has a national election, and they are trying to adapt themselves to the changed diplomatic situation based on their own national interest. So I think, personally, what the new government needs to do is to deliver its policy orientations to its the diplomatic counterparts and try to get their understanding and supported by consistently implementing the principled diplomacy with the principled diplomacy. So I hope that the next South Korean government will actively communicate with its diplomatic counterparts about its policy orientations and make the consistent diplomatic efforts to maintain good relationships with them. That it's going to be okay.
Right. And Dr. Go, what do you propose then to ensure a sense of consistency, as Professor Min said, with regard to North Korea policies?
So definitely, consistency is very important, and then also we shouldn't lose sight on our goal, which is the denuclearization of North Korea. I think North Korea, one thing that North Korea has been very consistent was developing its nuclear program. And the level of threats coming from North Korea has only increased consistently in the last 2 decades. But then our policy has been over the map in terms of how to respond to the new threats. Sometimes we actually minimize the perception of the threat. Sometimes we actually try to somehow ignore it. But I think by now it's very clear that North Korea is only going to be more obsessed about its nuclear and missile programs. In that sense, I think we should focus on strengthening our deterrence against North Korea, while at the same time trying the diplomatic venues as much as possible.
Right, to ensure that dialogue remains on the table.
Exactly.
All right, Dr. Go, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts. And
Always
Professor Min, here in the studio, thank you for your insights. And Dr. Cronin, over in the US, thank you very much for being with us at this very late hour at your end.